November 17th, 1965, 1:30 in the afternoon. In a small clearing in the Ia Drang Valley of South Vietnam, 375 American soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment are strung out in a long, vulnerable column through elephant grass and scrub jungle. They're heading to a landing zone called Albany, a place most of them have never heard of, for an extraction that will take them out of this nightmare valley. They've been marching for 3 miles in the oppressive heat, exhausted from days of combat, confident that the worst is behind them. They have no idea that 550 North Vietnamese soldiers are waiting in the trees and grass around them, close enough to hear them breathe, watching every move, preparing to spring the deadliest ambush in the history of the Vietnam War. In the next 4 hours, 155 Americans will die in the most savage close-quarters combat of the entire war. 121 more will be wounded. Units will be annihilated. Friends will die in each other's arms. Men will fight hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers they can't see in grass taller than their heads. And the survivors will carry the scars of this terrible afternoon for the rest of their lives. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This is the story of Landing Zone Albany. It's a story that has been overshadowed by the more famous battle at LZ Sexray 2 days earlier, the battle made famous by the book and movie We Were Soldiers. But Albany was worse. Albany was a catastrophe. Albany was the day when a battalion of American cavalry troopers walked into hell and barely made it out alive. The Battle of LZ Albany was the bloodiest single day of combat for American forces in the entire Vietnam War. More men died in those 4 hours than on any other day of America's 10-year involvement in Vietnam. It was a disaster born of fatigue, overconfidence, poor reconnaissance, and an enemy that understood the American way of war better than the Americans understood theirs. It was the day that showed the North Vietnamese they could defeat American forces in direct combat if they got close enough, if they grabbed the Americans by the belt and fought so close that American artillery and air power couldn't help. This is not a story of failure or cowardice. The men who fought at LZ Albany showed incredible courage, fighting desperate odds, saving their comrades, holding on when everything around them was chaos and death. But it is a story of mistakes at the command level, of tactical errors that cost lives, of an American battalion that walked into an ambush that could have been avoided and that should have been detected long before the first shot was fired. The Battle of LZ Albany happened just 2 days after the Battle of LZ X-Ray, where Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had fought off repeated North Vietnamese attacks and held their ground through sheer courage and firepower. X-Ray was hailed as a victory, proof that American forces could defeat the North Vietnamese in conventional combat. But the story didn't end at X-Ray. The story continued 2 miles away at Albany, where the lessons of X-Ray were forgotten and a fresh battalion walked into disaster. To understand what happened at Landing Zone Albany, you need to understand where it happened and why American forces were there in the first place. The Ia Drang Valley sits in the central highlands of South Vietnam in Pleiku Province near the border with Cambodia. It's remote, mountainous terrain, covered in jungle and elephant grass, cut through with streams and dotted with small clearings. The valley lies at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, a 2,400-foot mountain that in 1965 served as a sanctuary and base area for North Vietnamese forces operating in South Vietnam. The Ia Drang Valley was strategically important because it sat astride one of the main infiltration routes from North Vietnam into the south. North Vietnamese troops and supplies came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia, then moved through the central highlands toward the coast and the populated areas of South Vietnam. The valley was a staging area, a place where North Vietnamese units could assemble, rest, and prepare for operations deeper into South Vietnam. In October 1965, intelligence indicated that 3 regiments of North Vietnamese regulars, perhaps 6,000 men, were operating in the Pleiku Province area. These weren't Viet Cong guerrillas. These were professional soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam, well-trained, well-equipped, and determined. They had come south with a mission: to attack American Special Forces camps, cut South Vietnam in half through the Central Highlands, and achieve a decisive victory that would break American will to continue the war. The American response was to deploy the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, a new type of unit that used helicopters to achieve mobility and to bring combat power to bear quickly across difficult terrain. The 1st Cav, as it was known, had arrived in Vietnam just 2 months earlier in September 1965. It was the first full division committed to combat in Vietnam, and it represented a revolutionary approach to warfare. Instead of moving on foot or in vehicles, the division's infantry battalions would be lifted by helicopter directly into combat, supported by helicopter gunships and massive amounts of artillery fire. The commander of the 1st Cavalry Division was Major General Harry Kinnard, an innovative officer who believed in the potential of airmobile operations. The division's mission in the Central Highlands was to find and destroy the North Vietnamese forces before they could achieve their objectives. This was search and destroy warfare at its inception, the strategy that would define much of the American approach to the Vietnam War. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with superior firepower. In early November 1965, North Vietnamese forces laid siege to a special forces camp at Plei My, about 25 miles south of Pleiku. The attack on Plei My was repulsed, but intelligence indicated that the attacking forces had withdrawn toward the Chu Pong Massif in the Ia Drang Valley. This presented an opportunity. If American forces could pursue the North Vietnamese back to their base areas and engage them there, they could inflict significant casualties and disrupt enemy plans for future operations. On November 14, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, commander of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, led his battalion into Landing Zone X-Ray, a small clearing at the base of Chu Pong Mountain. What Moore didn't know was that he was landing his battalion of 450 men directly adjacent to base camps housing 3 North Vietnamese regiments totaling several thousand soldiers. What followed was 3 days of desperate combat that would be chronicled in the book and later the movie We Were Soldiers. The Battle of LZ X-Ray was everything that LZ Albany was not. At X-Ray, Moore had time to prepare his defensive positions. He had excellent artillery support from batteries positioned at Landing Zone Falcon, 6 miles away. He had near-constant air support, including B-52 strikes on the mountain that killed hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers. And perhaps most importantly, Moore had control of his battalion. He knew where his companies were, he could communicate with them, and he could coordinate their actions and supporting fires. The North Vietnamese attacked X-Ray in human wave assaults, attempting to overrun the American positions through sheer numbers and courage. The fighting was savage and close quarters at times, but the Americans held. Moore's battalion, reinforced by companies from other battalions, fought off repeated attacks. American firepower was devastating. Artillery rounds fell constantly around the perimeter. Helicopter gunships made gun runs on enemy formations. Tactical airstrikes dropped bombs and napalm on North Vietnamese positions. And when the North Vietnamese got close enough, American soldiers cut them down with rifle fire and machine guns. By November 16th, after 3 days of combat, the North Vietnamese had withdrawn from the immediate area around LZ X-Ray. American casualties were significant: 79 killed and 121 wounded from Moore's battalion, plus additional casualties from the supporting units. But North Vietnamese casualties were far higher, estimated at over 600 killed in the fighting around X-Ray alone. In terms of casualty exchange ratio, X-Ray was an American victory. Moore had proven that American forces could defeat North Vietnamese regulars in conventional combat. But the North Vietnamese hadn't given up. They'd withdrawn to regroup and to look for another opportunity. And that opportunity would come at LZ Albany, where they would show that they'd learned from X-Ray, that they understood the American reliance on firepower, and that they had a way to neutralize it. Get so close to the Americans that artillery and air support couldn't be used without killing Americans as well as North Vietnamese. While Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and his 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry were fighting for their lives at LZ X-Ray, another battalion of the 7th Cavalry was preparing to join the battle. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, had been alerted for deployment to the Ia Drang Valley. McDade's battalion would relieve Moore's exhausted troops at X-Ray and continue operations in the area. Robert McDade was 42 years old, a career officer with an impressive record. He was a veteran of World War II and Korea, holder of 3 Purple Hearts and 2 Silver Stars. He was intelligent, experienced, and professional. But McDade had one significant disadvantage as he prepared to lead his battalion into combat at Ia Drang. He had been in command of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, for less than 3 weeks. He didn't know his company commanders well. He didn't know the personalities and capabilities of his junior officers and NCOs, and he hadn't had time to establish the kind of command relationships that are crucial in combat. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was an understrength unit, as most units were in Vietnam in 1965. On paper, an infantry battalion should have about 800 men. In reality, McDade's battalion had about 400 soldiers, split among 5 rifle companies: Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Headquarters Company. These were good soldiers, volunteers, and draftees who had trained together and who were ready for combat. But they were tired. They'd been in the field for days, humping through the jungle in the oppressive heat, carrying heavy loads, getting little sleep. The company commanders of 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry were young captains, most in their mid-20s, leading companies of 100 to 120 men each. These officers had been trained in the tactics and techniques of conventional warfare, but Vietnam was teaching them that the textbook solutions didn't always work in this environment. The enemy didn't fight the way the textbooks said he would. The terrain was more difficult than anything they'd trained on, and the stress of combat command was testing them in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. Alpha Company was commanded by Captain Joel Sugg Dennis. Alpha would be at the head of the column on the march to LZ Albany, the point company that would lead the way. Bravo Company was commanded by Captain Myron Dedurick, a steady officer who would prove himself in the coming battle. Charlie Company, commanded by Captain John Fesmeyer, would take the heaviest casualties of any company at Albany. Delta Company, commanded by Captain George Forrest, and Headquarters Company, with the battalion command group, rounded out the battalion. On November 16th, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was helicoptered into LZ X-Ray to relieve Moore's 1st Battalion. The scene that greeted them was sobering. The landing zone was pockmarked with shell craters. There were blood-soaked bandages and discarded equipment everywhere. The smell of death hung in the air, a mixture of decomposing bodies, explosives, and the jungle itself. Moore's men looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, moving with the slow deliberation of soldiers who had been through hell and survived. McDade met with Moore, and Moore shared what he had learned in 3 days of combat. The North Vietnamese were still in the area in strength. They were aggressive, willing to take casualties, and very dangerous. Moore emphasized the importance of artillery support, of maintaining communications, of keeping units together where they could support each other. These were lessons written in blood, and Moore wanted to make sure McDade understood them. That night, November 16th, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry occupied the positions around LZ X-Ray that Moore's battalion had defended. It was a tense night. Everyone was on 100% alert, expecting another North Vietnamese attack. Sporadic gunfire echoed through the darkness as nervous soldiers fired at shadows or at North Vietnamese stragglers still in the area. But no major attack came. The North Vietnamese were regrouping, preparing for the next phase of the battle. The morning of November 17th brought new orders. B-52 bombers based in Guam were going to carpet bomb the slopes of Chu Pong Mountain, trying to destroy the North Vietnamese base camps and assembly areas. To avoid the risk of friendly fire casualties, all American forces needed to be at least 2 miles away from the impact area. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry would march overland to a new landing zone designated Albany, about 2.5 miles to the northeast of X-Ray. From Albany, the battalion would be extracted by helicopter and flown back to the division base camp. The march to Albany was presented as an administrative movement, a tactical road march through an area that was supposedly clear of enemy forces. The battalion would move in column, following a trail and heading cross-country through elephant grass and scattered jungle. It wouldn't be a combat patrol with heavy security. It would be a movement to a pickup zone, getting out of the way of the bombers, preparing to go home after days in the field. This characterization of the march as administrative rather than tactical would prove to be a fatal error. The area between X-Ray and Albany was not clear. The North Vietnamese had not withdrawn from the Ia Drang Valley. They were still there, watching, waiting, looking for an opportunity. and the Americans were about to give them that opportunity. At 0900 hours on November 17, 1965, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, began its march from LZ X-Ray toward LZ Albany. Also moving out that morning was the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tully. Tully's battalion would march to a different extraction point called Landing Zone Columbus. The two battalions would move together initially, then separate, with Tully continuing north and McDade breaking off to the northeast toward Albany. The column that set out from X-Ray that morning was long and vulnerable. With two battalions moving together initially, the column stretched for over half a mile through the elephant grass and scrub jungle. Soldiers moved in single file or small groups, following the men ahead of them, carrying their weapons and equipment, already tired from days in the field and looking forward to extraction and a hot meal back at base camp. Lieutenant Colonel Tully's battalion was in the lead, with McDade's battalion following. This arrangement meant that Tully, the more experienced battalion commander, who had been in command of his unit for 18 months, would be breaking trail and providing navigation for both battalions. It also meant that McDade's battalion was at the rear of the column, more vulnerable if the column was attacked because they would have less time to react. The terrain through which they marched was typical of the Ia Drang Valley, rolling hills covered in elephant grass that grew to 6 or 8 feet tall in places, scattered clumps of trees that provided some shade but also concealment for potential enemy positions, and dry creek beds and gullies that cut through the landscape. Visibility was limited. A soldier in the column could see perhaps 50 yards ahead and to the sides, but beyond that, the grass and trees blocked the view. It was perfect ambush country, and everyone knew it. But the march was supposed to be safe. Intelligence said the North Vietnamese had withdrawn from the area. The B-52 strikes would hit the mountain at noon, and any remaining enemy forces would either be killed by the bombing or would be fleeing the area. There was no indication of enemy presence along the route to Albany, so the security measures were minimal. There were point elements ahead of the column, but they weren't moving with the caution and deliberate pace of a combat patrol. The column wasn't maintaining proper intervals between soldiers and units, and there was no significant reconnaissance ahead of the column or to the flanks. After about 3 miles of marching, at approximately 1100 hours, the two battalions reached the point where they would separate. Tully's battalion continued north toward Columbus. McDade's battalion broke off to the northeast, heading toward Albany. As Tully's troops disappeared into the elephant grass, the men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, suddenly felt very alone. They were now a single battalion moving through enemy territory with no other friendly forces nearby. The column continued its march toward Albany. Captain Joel Sugdinis and Alpha Company were in the lead, about 120 men strung out in a long line. Behind Alpha came the battalion headquarters element, with Lieutenant Colonel McDade, his staff, and the radio operators who kept him in communication with his companies and with higher headquarters. Behind the headquarters element came Charlie Company, then Delta Company, then Bravo Company bringing up the rear. This formation was tactically unsound for several reasons. The battalion was stretched out over 550 yards, making it impossible for companies to support each other if attacked. The intervals between soldiers and units were too large, creating gaps in the column that an enemy could exploit, and the battalion commander was in the middle of the column, rather than in a position where he could control the entire battalion and make decisions based on what was happening at both the front and rear. But McDade was following standard operating procedures for a tactical road march. The company commanders were supposed to be responsible for their own units. The headquarters element stayed in the middle of the column, where it could communicate with all companies. And the assumption was that if the column was attacked, there would be time to react, to get units into proper positions, to call for artillery and air support before the situation became critical. At approximately 1300 hours, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the head of the column, Alpha Company, reached LZ Albany. Albany was a small clearing, maybe 75 yards across, with elephant grass around the edges and a small clump of trees in the center dividing the clearing into 2 sections. It wasn't much, but it was large enough for helicopters to land and extract troops. McDade and his command group were still about 400 yards behind Alpha Company, in the middle of the long column. Charlie Company was behind McDade, and Delta and Bravo companies were strung out to the rear. When Alpha Company reached Albany, McDade radioed Captain Sugdinis and told him to secure the landing zone. Then McDade made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He called his company commanders forward to the clearing for a meeting to discuss how to array the battalion for extraction. This was standard procedure, getting the leaders together to brief them on the plan and make sure everyone understood their responsibilities. But it meant pulling the company commanders away from their units at a time when the battalion was most vulnerable, spread out in a long column through unfamiliar terrain. Captain Sugdinis of Alpha Company was already at the LZ, so he could attend the meeting immediately. Captain Fesmeyer of Charlie Company, Captain Forrest of Delta Company, and Captain Diderik of Bravo Company all left their units and started moving forward through the column toward the clearing where McDade was waiting. The companies they left behind were now leaderless, commanded by executive officers or senior sergeants who didn't have the authority or the situational awareness of the company commanders. As the company commanders made their way forward through the column, soldiers took the opportunity to rest. They dropped their packs, sat down in the grass, lit cigarettes, drank water from their canteens. After 3 miles of marching in the heat, they were exhausted and glad for the break. Some soldiers wandered a few yards off the trail to relieve themselves. Others just lay back in the grass and closed their eyes. The column, already spread out and poorly organized, became even less ready to fight. No one had conducted any reconnaissance of the area around Albany. No patrols had been sent out to check the tree lines and the tall grass for signs of enemy presence. The battalion was halted in place, waiting for the company commanders to meet with McDade, waiting for the plan for extraction, not expecting any trouble because intelligence said the area was clear, but the area wasn't clear. Hidden in the trees and grass around the American column, invisible to the tired soldiers resting in the clearing and along the trail, were 2 battalions of North Vietnamese regulars totaling over 550 men. The 8th Battalion, 66th Regiment, and elements of the 3rd Battalion, 33rd Regiment, had been resting in this exact area when the American column stumbled into them. The North Vietnamese had watched the Americans approach, had seen the long column stretched out and vulnerable, and had quickly made plans to attack. The North Vietnamese commanders understood that this was an opportunity that might not come again. An entire American battalion was spread out before them, disorganized, unsuspecting, with poor security. If they could attack quickly and get in close, if they could prevent the Americans from organizing a defense and calling in artillery and air support, they could destroy this battalion just as they had tried and failed to destroy Moore's battalion at X-Ray 2 days earlier. But this time would be different. This time, they would get close, so close that American firepower couldn't save them. At approximately 13:15, just 15 minutes after Alpha Company had reached LZ Albany, all hell broke loose. The attack began with a few shots. Alpha Company's reconnaissance platoon, which had moved a short distance beyond the clearing into the trees, walked almost on top of the headquarters element of the 3rd Battalion, 33rd North Vietnamese Regiment. Someone fired, then someone else, and suddenly the reconnaissance platoon was in a close-range firefight with North Vietnamese soldiers who emerged from the grass and trees like ghosts. The sound of gunfire was the signal for the main attack. From 3 sides, the North Vietnamese attacked the American column with overwhelming violence and speed. Hundreds of soldiers, who had been lying silently in the grass and trees within yards of the American positions, opened fire simultaneously. AK-47 assault rifles crackled in long bursts. RPG rockets whooshed through the air and exploded among the American troops. Mortars began falling on the column from pre-registered positions. And then the North Vietnamese charged, running through the elephant grass, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, closing with the Americans before they could react. The American soldiers were caught completely by surprise. One moment they were resting, smoking, waiting for the word to move out. The next moment they were fighting for their lives against an enemy who was on top of them. So close they could see the faces of the North Vietnamese soldiers who were trying to kill them. There was no time to get into defensive positions, no time to organize a coordinated response, no time to do anything but grab weapons and start shooting at whoever was shooting at you. The North Vietnamese tactics were based on their experiences fighting the French and on what they'd learned at LZ X-Ray 2 days earlier. They knew that American firepower was devastating at range. They knew that American artillery and air support could slaughter troops caught in the open, so they made sure they weren't caught in the open. They attacked from close range, from within the tall grass and tree lines where they had concealment. And they closed immediately with the American positions, getting so close that the Americans couldn't call in artillery or airstrikes without hitting their own men. This tactic was called grabbing the enemy by the belt, getting so close to American positions that the two forces became intermingled, making it impossible to use supporting fires. It was a tactic that required courage and discipline, because it meant attacking into American fire, taking casualties, pressing forward even when men were falling. But it was effective. By closing immediately with the American column, the North Vietnamese neutralized the greatest American advantages: firepower and technology. The American column disintegrated under the sudden, violent attack. The long line of soldiers scattered, individuals and small groups taking cover wherever they could find it, in the tall grass, behind ant hills, in dry creek beds. Officers and NCOs tried to organize defensive positions, to get soldiers firing back, to establish some kind of coherent defense. But it was chaos. No one knew where the enemy was coming from. No one knew where friendly units were, or where the boundaries between units should be. Everyone was fighting their own individual battle, trying to survive, trying to help whoever was near them. Charlie Company, which had been in the middle of the column behind the battalion, headquarters element, took the brunt of the initial attack. The North Vietnamese hit Charlie Company from multiple directions simultaneously, and within minutes the company had ceased to exist as an organized unit. Soldiers were scattered, cut off from each other, fighting in small, isolated groups or alone. The company commander, Captain John Fesmeyer, was forward at the commander's meeting when the attack began. His executive officer and many of his platoon leaders were killed in the first minutes of the fighting. Charlie Company would suffer the highest casualties of any unit at Albany, over 70% killed or wounded. Sergeant First Class James Scott, the battalion sergeant major, was near the head of the column when the attack began. He hit the ground immediately and started returning fire toward the muzzle flashes he could see in the trees. A North Vietnamese soldier appeared in the grass 10 feet away, raising his AK-47 to fire. Scott shot him first, then shot another enemy soldier who was right behind the first. Then Scott felt a burning impact in his side as an AK round hit him. He kept firing, killing 2 more North Vietnamese soldiers before another round hit him in the arm. Wounded twice, Scott continued to fight, organizing the soldiers around him, directing their fire, refusing medical attention because there were others who needed it more. Private First Class James Young was with Charlie Company when the ambush was sprung. He was sitting on his pack, resting, when the shooting started. Young grabbed his M16 rifle and looked around wildly, trying to figure out where the enemy was. He saw North Vietnamese soldiers running through the grass toward him, firing their weapons. Young started shooting, pulled the trigger, and held it down, burning through an entire magazine on full automatic. He didn't know if he hit anyone. He reloaded and fired again. Then something hit him in the chest, a hammer blow that knocked him backward. He'd been shot. Young looked down and saw blood spreading across his shirt. He tried to get up but couldn't. The pain was incredible. He lay back in the grass and waited for death or rescue, whichever came first. Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, the executive officer of Alpha Company, was with the battalion headquarters element when the attack began. Gwynn heard the firing from ahead, where Alpha's recon platoon had made contact, then heard firing break out all along the column behind him. He realized immediately that this wasn't a small engagement. This was a major attack on the entire battalion. Gwynn started trying to organize the soldiers around him to establish a defensive perimeter around the battalion command post, but soldiers were running in every direction, some toward the enemy fire, some away from it, everyone confused and scared. Lieutenant Colonel McDade was forward in the clearing when the attack began. He'd been waiting for his company commanders to arrive for the briefing on extraction. Procedures. Now, instead of briefing them on a routine extraction, he was trying to figure out what was happening and how to respond. McDade grabbed radios and started trying to contact his companies, to get situation reports, to understand the scope of the attack. But communications were spotty. Some units weren't responding. Others were reporting that they were under heavy attack from multiple directions. The picture that emerged was terrifying. His battalion was being destroyed. McDade tried to call for artillery support, for fire missions on the areas where the North Vietnamese were attacking from. But there was a problem. To call artillery effectively, you need to know where your own troops are and where the enemy is. McDade didn't know either with any precision. His companies were scattered along 550 yards of trail, mixed up with North Vietnamese soldiers who were attacking from all directions. If he called artillery on the wrong coordinates, he might kill his own men. So, McDade hesitated, trying to get better information, trying to figure out where it was safe to shoot. This hesitation, born of the chaos and the lack of information, would cost lives. At LZ X-Ray, Hal Moore had directed artillery fire almost continuously, keeping the enemy at distance, killing North Vietnamese soldiers before they could close with American positions. But at Albany, there would be no effective artillery support for critical minutes at the beginning of the battle, minutes when the North Vietnamese were closing with American positions and establishing the close-range melee that would define the battle. The North Vietnamese attack was not just random violence. It was a carefully coordinated assault designed to accomplish specific objectives. One element attacked Alpha Company at the head of the column, trying to isolate them from the rest of the battalion. Another element attacked the battalion headquarters, trying to kill or capture the American commanders and destroy the command and control of the battalion. The main effort was directed at Charlie and Delta companies in the middle of the column, where the attack could split the American battalion in half. And another element set up positions to block any reinforcement from Bravo Company at the tail of the column. Within the first 15 minutes of the attack, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Companies were scattered and leaderless. Platoons were cut off from each other. Small groups of soldiers fought desperate individual actions against overwhelming numbers. The battalion command post was under direct attack and barely functioning, and casualties were mounting with horrifying speed. Soldiers were dying faster than medics could treat them. Wounded men lay in the grass calling for help that wasn't coming, and the North Vietnamese kept attacking, kept pressing, kept killing. In the chaos of the ambush at LZ Albany, small groups of American soldiers began to fight back, not as a coordinated battalion, but as isolated pockets of resistance. These men showed incredible courage, holding positions against overwhelming odds, rescuing wounded comrades, killing North Vietnamese soldiers at point-blank range, doing whatever they could to survive and to keep fighting. Captain Myron DeDurick and Bravo Company were at the tail of the column when the attack began. They heard the firing ahead and immediately started moving forward to help. But as they advanced, they ran into North Vietnamese soldiers who had positioned themselves specifically to block any reinforcement. Bravo Company found itself in its own firefight, unable to link up with the rest of the battalion, forced to fight for its own survival, while the rest of the battalion was being destroyed ahead of them. Diederich was an experienced and capable officer. He quickly assessed the situation and realized that if he tried to push forward through the North Vietnamese positions, his company would be destroyed piecemeal. Instead, he pulled Bravo Company into a tight defensive perimeter, positioned his machine guns for mutual support, and prepared to hold his ground. This decision probably saved his company. While the rest of the battalion was scattered and taking heavy casualties, Bravo Company maintained cohesion and fought an organized defensive battle. At the head of the column, Alpha Company's situation was desperate. They had been hit hard in the initial attack, with the reconnaissance platoon almost wiped out in the first minutes. Captain Sugdinis was trying to organize whatever men he could reach, pulling them back toward the clearing, trying to establish a perimeter. But North Vietnamese soldiers were everywhere, firing from the trees, charging through the grass, throwing grenades into American positions. Sergeant Clyde Savage was with Alpha Company when the attack began. He was a squad leader, responsible for 9 men. And when the shooting started, his first thought was to keep his squad together and get them into a fighting position. Savage found a slight depression in the ground, not much but better than nothing, and got his men down behind it. They started returning fire, trying to engage the North Vietnamese soldiers they could see moving through the grass. Then a grenade landed among them, a Chi-Com stick grenade, and detonated with a flash and a bang. 2 of Savage's men went down, wounded by fragments. Savage grabbed bandages from his first aid pouch and started treating them, while his other men kept firing. Private First Class Arthur Vieira was an M60 machine gunner with Alpha Company. When the ambush was sprung, Vieira set up his machine gun and started pouring fire into the tree line where North Vietnamese soldiers were firing from. The M60 was a belt-fed weapon that could fire 550 rounds per minute. and Vieira used it like a fire hose, sweeping back and forth, trying to suppress the enemy fire. His assistant gunner fed belts of ammunition into the weapon while Vieira fired. Then Vieira felt something hit his leg, a burning pain that made him cry out. He'd been shot, but he kept firing the machine gun, kept fighting, because if he stopped, the men around him would die. Vieira would eventually be awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. In the center of the column, where the battalion headquarters element was located, the situation was chaotic and terrifying. North Vietnamese soldiers had penetrated to within yards of the command post, shooting at radio operators, throwing grenades, trying to kill the battalion commander and his staff. The headquarters security element, clerks and radio operators who weren't frontline combat troops, found themselves in a desperate close-range fight against enemy soldiers who seemed to be everywhere. Specialist 4th Class Jack Smith was a headquarters company soldier who suddenly found himself fighting for his life. Smith had never fired his weapon in combat before. Now he was shooting at North Vietnamese soldiers he could see moving through the grass, enemy troops so close he could hear them talking to each other. Smith fired until his rifle ran dry, reloaded, fired again. He saw an American soldier next to him get hit, saw the man fall and lie still. He saw another American stand up to throw a grenade and get cut down by AK fire before the grenade left his hand. It was nightmare, surreal, and terrifying, and Smith wondered if he would survive the next 5 minutes. Lieutenant Gwynn, the Alpha Company executive officer, was trying to organize a defensive perimeter around the battalion command post. He got soldiers positioned behind whatever cover they could find, established fields of fire, got the machine guns set up where they could support each other. But it was difficult. Soldiers were scattered everywhere. Communications were breaking down. And the North Vietnamese kept attacking, kept pressing, kept trying to break through and overrun the American positions. Artillery support, which should have been immediate and devastating, was slow to arrive, and when it did come, it was dangerous to both sides. McDade had finally called for fire missions, bringing artillery from Firebase Falcon down on suspected North Vietnamese positions. But the shells were landing close, very close to American positions. Some rounds fell short, impacting among American troops, killing and wounding soldiers who were already hard-pressed by the enemy attack. The artillery, which at X-ray had been a lifesaver, at Albany was almost as dangerous to the Americans as it was to the North Vietnamese. Air support was equally problematic. Helicopter gunships arrived overhead and started making gun runs, firing their miniguns and rockets at targets marked by smoke grenades. But in the tall grass and confused fighting, it was almost impossible to distinguish American positions from North Vietnamese positions. Pilots made their best guesses, firing at what they thought were enemy troops, but sometimes they guessed wrong. Several American soldiers were killed or wounded by friendly fire from the helicopter gunships that were supposed to be supporting them. Specialist 4th Class Bob Towles was with Charlie Company in the middle of the hell that was the center of the ambush. He'd been hit 3 times already, wounded in the arm, the leg, and the side. He was lying in the grass, bleeding, unable to move effectively. Watching North Vietnamese soldiers walk through the American positions, shooting wounded men who couldn't defend themselves. Towles played dead, lying motionless even when North Vietnamese soldiers stepped over him, praying they wouldn't shoot him, praying someone would come to help him before he bled out. Medics moved through the battlefield with incredible courage, treating wounded soldiers under fire, dragging men to cover, performing first aid while bullets snapped past their heads. Specialist 4th Class Charles Lewes was a medic with Charlie Company. When the ambush began, Lewes started moving toward the wounded, completely exposing himself to enemy fire. He treated one soldier, then another, working methodically despite the chaos around him. He was shot twice while treating wounded men, but kept working. He would treat over 30 soldiers that afternoon before he was finally killed by a burst of AK fire. Lewes would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Albany. The North Vietnamese were also taking casualties, significant casualties. American soldiers might have been caught by surprise and scattered, but they were well trained and they fought back hard. The M16 rifles that American soldiers carried could fire on full automatic, and at close range they were devastating. American machine gunners cut down North Vietnamese soldiers as they charged through the grass. American grenadiers fired M79 grenades into enemy positions. and when North Vietnamese soldiers got too close, Americans fought them hand-to-hand with rifle butts, knives, and fists. Sergeant James Gooden was fighting with a group of soldiers from Charlie Company when a North Vietnamese soldier charged at him through the grass. Gooden fired his M16, but the rifle jammed, a common problem with the early M16s in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese soldier was on him before he could clear the jam, swinging his AK like a club. Gooden blocked the blow with his rifle, then drove forward, tackling the enemy soldier. They fell to the ground, grappling, each man trying to kill the other. Gooden got his hands around the North Vietnamese soldier's throat and squeezed until the man stopped struggling. When he let go, the enemy soldier was dead. Gooden grabbed the man's AK-47, checked that it was loaded, and kept fighting. By 1400 hours, 1 hour after the ambush had begun, the situation had stabilized somewhat. The initial shock of the attack had passed. American soldiers had found whatever cover they could, and were fighting organized defensive actions from their scattered positions. The North Vietnamese continued to attack, but their assaults were less coordinated now, more like probing attacks than the overwhelming rush of the initial ambush. Both sides had taken heavy casualties, and both sides were exhausted. But the battle was far from over. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was still scattered across 500 yards of elephant grass and jungle. Companies couldn't support each other. Many soldiers were cut off from their units, fighting alone or in small groups. The wounded lay everywhere, calling for help, bleeding, dying, and the North Vietnamese, though they'd taken heavy casualties, still had hundreds of soldiers in the area, still had the initiative, still had the Americans at their mercy. Lieutenant Colonel McDade was trying to regain control of his battalion, but it was nearly impossible. His companies were scattered and leaderless. Communications were sporadic at best. He didn't know how many men he'd lost, or where the survivors were located. He couldn't maneuver his units because he didn't have effective control of them. All he could do was try to hold the positions they had, call for support, and hope that reinforcements arrived before the battalion was completely destroyed. The call for reinforcements had gone out immediately when the ambush began. Brigade headquarters at Landing Zone Crooks had been alerted that the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry was in heavy contact and taking significant casualties. But getting reinforcements to Albany wasn't simple. The nearest friendly unit was Lieutenant Colonel Tully's battalion at Landing Zone Columbus, about 2 miles away. Tully's troops were exhausted from their own march, and they'd have to fight their way to Albany through North Vietnamese positions. Helicopters could bring in reinforcements faster, but landing helicopters in a hot LZ, a landing zone under fire, was extremely dangerous and would expose the helicopters to intense enemy fire. As the afternoon wore on and the fighting continued, it became clear that the Battle of LZ Albany was going to be one of the worst disasters of the entire Vietnam War. The body count was climbing, the number of wounded was overwhelming the medical personnel who were trying to treat them, and there was no end in sight. The North Vietnamese showed no sign of breaking off the attack. If anything, they seemed to be reinforcing, bringing in additional troops to finish off the Americans. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were fighting for their lives in what would become known as the bloodiest single day of combat in the Vietnam War. And the battle was only half over. As the battle entered its second hour, the scattered elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were fighting dozens of separates. Desperate actions across the killing ground of LZ Albany. There was no front line, no clear distinction between friendly and enemy positions. The battlefield was a chaos of smoke, noise, and violent death, with small groups of Americans fighting off North Vietnamese attacks from multiple directions while trying to treat their wounded and maintain some semblance of organization. Captain Sug Dinis and what remained of Alpha Company had pulled back to form a defensive perimeter at the northern end of the clearing. They'd taken heavy casualties in the initial attack, with the reconnaissance platoon nearly wiped out and many soldiers killed or wounded in the first minutes of fighting. But Alpha Company maintained better cohesion than most units at Albany, largely because Sugdinis was with his company when the attack began and was able to immediately organize a defense. Alpha Company's perimeter was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, with soldiers positioned behind whatever cover they could find or scrape out of the earth. Machine guns were sighted to provide interlocking fields of fire. Riflemen filled in the gaps between machine gun positions. And in the center of the perimeter, medics worked frantically to treat the wounded, men with gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations, every type of injury that modern weapons inflict on human flesh. Sergeant First Class James Scott, the battalion sergeant major, had made his way to Alpha Company's perimeter despite his 2 gunshot wounds. Scott refused medical treatment, insisting that there were others who needed it more. He moved around the perimeter, checking positions, encouraging soldiers, directing fire at North Vietnamese positions. When he saw soldiers huddling behind cover and not returning fire, he kicked them and cursed at them until they started shooting. When ammunition ran low, he redistributed magazines from the dead to the living. Scott was everywhere, a rock of stability in the chaos, showing the kind of leadership that NCOs have shown in every American war. The battalion headquarters element, with Lieutenant Colonel McDade, had established its own defensive perimeter in the center of what had been the column. McDade was still trying to understand what was happening, to get situation reports from his scattered companies, to coordinate supporting fires and plan for reinforcement or extraction. But it was frustratingly difficult. Radio communications kept breaking down, units weren't responding to calls, and the reports he was getting painted a picture of catastrophe. Companies destroyed, heavy casualties, positions being overrun. Lieutenant Gwynn, still with the headquarters element, had organized the clerks, radio operators, and other support personnel into a fighting force. These weren't frontline infantrymen. They were headquarters troops who spent most of their time on administrative tasks. But now they were fighting like infantry, shooting at enemy soldiers, throwing grenades, holding positions against North Vietnamese attacks. Gwynn moved among them, positioning soldiers, directing fire, trying to keep them from panicking, as North Vietnamese soldiers continued to probe their perimeter, looking for weak points. Delta Company, in the middle rear of the original column, had been hit hard in the initial attack, but had managed to form a defensive perimeter under the leadership of Captain George Forrest. Forrest had been moving forward for the commander's meeting when the attack began, but he'd immediately turned around and fought his way back to his company. Now, Delta Company was holding a position about 200 yards south of the battalion headquarters, maintaining radio contact with McDade, but unable to link up physically because North Vietnamese soldiers controlled the ground between them. The most desperate situation was Charlie Company. Captain Fesmeyer's company had been in the center of the column, right in the kill zone of the ambush, and it had been hit from 3 sides simultaneously. The company had shattered under the attack, breaking into small, isolated groups scattered across 100 yards of elephant grass and scrub jungle. The company commander was forward when the attack began, trying to reach the commander's meeting. The executive officer was killed in the first minutes. Platoon leaders were dead or wounded. The company had ceased to exist as an organized unit, replaced by desperate small groups fighting their own battles, trying to survive until help arrived. Private First Class Jack Smith, the headquarters soldier who found himself in the middle of the Charlie Company sector, lay in the grass next to several other American soldiers, all of them wounded, all of them trying to stay quiet and stay alive. North Vietnamese soldiers moved through the area, shooting wounded Americans who groaned or moved. Smith watched in horror as an enemy soldier stood over a wounded American and shot him in the head. Then the North Vietnamese soldier moved to the next American and did the same. Smith played dead, holding his breath, not moving even when the North Vietnamese soldier stepped over him. The soldier moved on. Smith had survived, but he'd never forget watching his comrades being executed. Specialist 4th Class Bob Towles, wounded 3 times and unable to move, lay in the grass for hours as the battle raged around him. He watched North Vietnamese soldiers move past him, sometimes within arm's reach. He watched other wounded Americans die from their wounds, calling out for medics who couldn't reach them. He watched the grass around him catch fire from tracer rounds and white phosphorus, and he couldn't move to escape the flames. He was certain he was going to die, either from his wounds, from execution by North Vietnamese soldiers, or from the fire that was spreading through the battlefield. But somehow he survived, lying motionless in the grass, waiting for rescue that seemed like it would never come. The North Vietnamese continued to attack throughout the afternoon, but their assaults became less coordinated as the day wore on. They had taken significant casualties in the initial attack and in the continued fighting. American firepower, even from scattered and disorganized positions, was devastating at close range. North Vietnamese soldiers who charged American positions were cut down by rifle and machine gun fire. Those who tried to maneuver closer were hit by grenades and M79 rounds. The North Vietnamese were learning the same lesson the Americans had learned. Close quarters combat in the elephant grass was a killing ground for both sides. Artillery support finally began to have an effect as the afternoon progressed. McDade and his forward observers got better coordination with the artillery batteries at Firebase Falcon. They adjusted fires based on reports from the scattered companies, walking artillery barrages around the American positions, trying to catch North Vietnamese soldiers in the open or in their assembly areas. The artillery wasn't as effective as it had been at X-ray, where Moore had been able to call precise fires on enemy positions he could observe. But it helped, forcing the North Vietnamese to be more cautious in their movements, killing some and wounding others. Tactical air support also arrived, though it faced the same problems as the artillery. In the confused fighting with American and North Vietnamese positions intermingled, it was hard to know where to strike. F-100 Super Sabre jets made runs with bombs and napalm on positions marked by smoke grenades, trying to hit North Vietnamese soldiers while avoiding American positions. Some strikes were effective, killing enemy troops and breaking up attacks. Other strikes missed their targets or hit too close to American positions. But like the artillery, the airstrikes helped by showing the North Vietnamese that American firepower was still a factor, even in the chaos of the close quarters battle. By 1600 hours, 3 hours after the ambush had begun, the intensity of the fighting had decreased. The North Vietnamese were no longer launching coordinated attacks on American positions. Instead, there was sporadic fire, sniping, occasional probing attacks to test American defenses. Both sides were exhausted, both had taken heavy casualties, and both were content to hold their positions and wait to see what would happen next. For the Americans, the priority was now treating the wounded and trying to evacuate them. Casualties were overwhelming. Every defensive perimeter had wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. Some had tourniquets stopping arterial bleeding, temporary measures that needed to be addressed by surgeons, or the men would lose limbs or die. Others had sucking chest wounds or abdominal wounds, injuries that required surgery to survive. And there were countless soldiers with lesser wounds, painful and debilitating, but not immediately life-threatening, who still needed treatment and evacuation. The problem was getting the wounded out. Helicopters were the only practical way to evacuate casualties from Albany, but the landing zone was still under fire. North Vietnamese snipers were shooting at anything that moved in the clearing. Landing helicopters would be sitting ducks, vulnerable to enemy fire and possibly to direct attack. But the wounded couldn't wait. Some were dying from their wounds, bleeding out despite the best efforts of the medics. They needed to get to field hospitals where surgeons could save them. The decision was made to bring in medevac helicopters despite the risk. Helicopter pilots were told the situation. The LZ was hot, casualties were urgent, and they needed to get in and out as quickly as possible. The pilots, showing the incredible courage that helicopter crews displayed throughout the Vietnam War, agreed to come in. They would land, load as many wounded as they could in seconds, and take off before the North Vietnamese could bring effective fire on them. The first medevac helicopter approached Albany at around 1630. Smoke grenades marked the landing zone, and the pilot came in fast and steep, flaring the aircraft at the last moment to bleed off speed. The helicopter touched down, and American soldiers immediately started loading wounded men aboard, lifting them, dragging them, throwing them into the cargo bay. The helicopter crew chief and door gunner helped pull wounded aboard while keeping their eyes on the tree line, ready to fire if North Vietnamese soldiers appeared. Within 30 seconds, the helicopter was full and the pilot pulled pitch, lifting off in a cloud of dust and grass, climbing away from the landing zone as enemy tracers reached up toward it. While the scattered elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry fought for survival at LZ Albany, desperate calls for help had been transmitted to brigade headquarters and to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tully's battalion at Landing Zone Columbus. Tully had reached Columbus with his 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, and was preparing to settle in for the night when he received urgent orders: march to Albany immediately and relieve the embattled battalion. Tully's troops were exhausted. They'd been marching all day, they'd been in the field for days, and they'd just finished securing their landing zone. The last thing they wanted to do was conduct another movement through enemy territory. But the situation at Albany was desperate, and Tully's battalion was the only friendly unit close enough to help in time. So, Tully got his troops moving, forming them into a column, and starting the 2-mile march back toward Albany. The march was cautious and deliberate, nothing like the administrative movement that McDade's battalion had conducted earlier that day. Tully put out flankers to screen the column. He maintained proper intervals between units. He moved slowly, checking the terrain ahead, making sure his battalion didn't walk into another ambush. This caution meant the march took time, precious time, during which men were dying at Albany. But Tully knew that arriving with his battalion intact was more important than arriving quickly with his battalion destroyed. As Tully's battalion approached Albany from the north, they began to hear the sounds of battle, the crack of small arms fire, the thump of grenades and mortars, the roar of jets making close air support runs. They also began to encounter North Vietnamese soldiers, enemy troops who were pulling back from the battle, or who were positioned to intercept reinforcements. There were brief, sharp firefights as Tully's lead elements cleared the North Vietnamese from their path. The column continued to advance, pushing toward the sound of guns. At approximately 17:30, about 4 hours after the ambush had begun, Tully's lead company made contact with the northern perimeter of Alpha Company's position at Albany. The relief had arrived. Tully immediately deployed his battalion to reinforce the American positions, to expand the perimeter, and to secure the landing zone so that medevac helicopters could operate more safely. His fresh troops took over positions from the exhausted soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, allowing wounded men to be treated and evacuated. The arrival of Tully's battalion changed the tactical situation dramatically. Instead of scattered, isolated pockets of American soldiers barely holding on, there was now an organized defensive perimeter with fresh troops, adequate ammunition, and the command and control to coordinate supporting fires effectively. The North Vietnamese, who had been probing American positions and maintaining pressure throughout the afternoon, began to pull back. They'd accomplished much of their mission. They'd inflicted heavy casualties on an American battalion, they'd demonstrated that they could fight effectively against American forces, and they'd proven that the hugging tactics worked. But they'd also taken significant casualties themselves, and with a fresh American battalion now on the scene, continuing the fight would be too costly. As darkness fell over the Ia Drang Valley on November 17th, the battlefield at LZ Albany gradually quieted. Sporadic firing continued as nervous soldiers shot at shadows or at North Vietnamese soldiers still in the area. But the major fighting was over. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn to regroup and to evacuate their own wounded and dead. The Americans were focused on consolidating their positions, treating and evacuating casualties, and accounting for their soldiers. The casualty count was staggering and would get worse as the full scope of the disaster became apparent. In 4 hours of fighting, 155 American soldiers had been killed. 121 more were wounded, many seriously. Of the 375 men in the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, who had started the march to Albany that morning, over 70% had become casualties. Some companies had been virtually destroyed. Charlie Company, which had been in the center of the ambush, had lost over 75% of its men killed or wounded. It was the bloodiest single day of combat for American forces in the entire Vietnam War. North Vietnamese casualties were also heavy, though exact numbers are disputed. American estimates claimed over 400 North Vietnamese killed at Albany, but these numbers were almost certainly inflated, as body counts often were in Vietnam. North Vietnamese sources admitted to approximately 200 casualties killed and wounded. The true number was probably somewhere in between. What's certain is that both sides paid a terrible price in blood at LZ Albany, and both sides would carry the scars of that battle for decades. The evacuation of wounded continued throughout the night and into the next day. Helicopter after helicopter landed at Albany, loaded wounded soldiers, and flew them to field hospitals at Pleiku and other locations. The most seriously wounded went first, men who would die without immediate surgery. Then came those with serious but not immediately life-threatening wounds. Finally came the walking wounded, men who could move under their own power, but who still needed medical treatment. The evacuation took hours, with helicopters shuttling back and forth, pilots and crews showing incredible courage as they flew into a landing zone that was still receiving occasional enemy fire. The dead were also evacuated. though with less urgency than the wounded. Bodies were collected from the battlefield, carried to the landing zone, and loaded onto helicopters. It was grim work, going through the elephant grass and finding American soldiers who had died where they fell. Some bodies were easy to identify. Others were badly mutilated by gunfire or grenades. Some soldiers were missing, either captured by the North Vietnamese or so badly dismembered that their remains couldn't be identified in the battlefield chaos. Each body represented a family that would receive a visit from a casualty notification officer, a telegram that would shatter their world, a life that had ended far from home in a distant jungle. Lieutenant Colonel McDade moved through the positions at Albany that night, checking on his soldiers, talking to survivors, trying to understand what had happened and why. He was in shock, both physical and psychological. His battalion had been destroyed. Over half his men were dead or wounded. Companies that he'd commanded that morning no longer existed as effective fighting units, and he bore responsibility for it. He'd been the battalion commander. He'd made the decisions that had led his battalion into the ambush. He'd called the commanders forward, leaving companies leaderless at the critical moment. The weight of those decisions, and of the lives lost because of them, would haunt McDade for the rest of his life. Captain Myron de Durick and Bravo Company, which had been at the tail of the column and had fought its own separate battle, arrived at the main Albany perimeter after dark. Bravo Company had taken casualties, but nothing like the carnage that had struck the rest of the battalion. Diederich's decision to pull his company into a tight defensive perimeter rather than trying to push forward through enemy positions had saved his company from being destroyed. Now, Bravo Company's relatively fresh troops helped secure the perimeter and assisted with the evacuation of casualties. The survivors of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, spent a long, tense night at Albany. Everyone was on full alert, expecting another North Vietnamese attack. The perimeter was strengthened with Tully's troops. Artillery was registered on likely enemy approach routes. Flares illuminated the battlefield throughout the night, casting eerie shadows that made everyone nervous. But no major attack came. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn, satisfied with the damage they had inflicted, unwilling to risk another engagement with now reinforced American positions. November 18th dawned gray and overcast over Albany. As light spread across the battlefield, the full extent of the catastrophe became visible. The elephant grass was trampled and blood-stained. Shell casings littered the ground by the thousands. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Weapons, packs, helmets, everything that soldiers carry. And there were bodies, American and North Vietnamese, lying where they had fallen, grim testament to the violence of the previous day's fighting. Search parties went out from the perimeter to sweep the battlefield, looking for wounded soldiers who might have survived the night, recovering bodies of the dead, collecting weapons and equipment. They found wounded men who had lain in the grass all night, unable to move, waiting for help. They found Americans who had been executed by North Vietnamese soldiers, shot in the head at close range. They found evidence of the close-quarters nature of the fighting, enemy and American bodies lying within feet of each other, hand-to-hand fighting positions, areas where the grass was matted down from men grappling in mortal combat. The Battle of LZ Albany officially ended on November 18th, when the surviving elements of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and Lieutenant Colonel Tully's battalion withdrew from the area. B-52 strikes hit the Chu Pong Massif, carpet bombing the suspected North Vietnamese base areas. The Ia Drang campaign was over. American forces would remain in the Central Highlands, but the major operations in the valley itself would end. The valley would be left to the North Vietnamese, a bitter irony given the price that had been paid to contest it. In the chaos and horror of LZ Albany, individual soldiers showed extraordinary courage, performing acts of heroism that saved lives and upheld the finest traditions of the American military. These weren't the calculated heroics of men who had time to think about what they were doing. These were spontaneous acts of courage by soldiers who acted on instinct and training, who put the lives of their comrades above their own safety, who fought when fighting seemed hopeless, and who refused to give up when surrender would have been easier. Specialist 4th Class Charles Lewes was a medic with Charlie Company. When the ambush erupted, Lewes immediately began moving toward the wounded, completely disregarding his own safety. In the chaos of the initial attack, with the North Vietnamese soldiers firing from all directions, Lewes moved from casualty to casual, applying bandages, starting IVs, stopping bleeding, doing whatever he could to keep men alive. He was shot in the arm, but continued treating wounded soldiers. He was shot in the leg, but kept moving, dragging himself to the next casualty. Other soldiers begged him to take cover, to stop exposing himself, but Luz refused. There were wounded men who needed him, and he would not abandon them. Luz treated over 30 soldiers during the battle, working for hours under fire, showing a level of courage that awed everyone who witnessed it. He was finally killed by a burst of AK-47 fire while treating a soldier with a sucking chest wound. The soldier he was treating survived because of Luz's efforts. Luz would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for his actions at LZ Albany. His citation reads in part, "Specialist Luz's conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and medical skill saved the lives of numerous wounded comrades. His actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Army." Sergeant First Class James Scott, the battalion sergeant major, was wounded twice in the opening minutes of the ambush, but refused medical treatment. Scott moved through the embattled positions, organizing soldiers, directing fire, redistributing ammunition, providing the kind of steady leadership that soldiers desperately needed in the chaos. When he found soldiers frozen with fear, hiding in the grass and not fighting back, Scott kicked them and cursed at them until they grabbed their weapons and started shooting. When he found wounded soldiers, Scott dragged them to cover and called for medics. When ammunition ran low, Scott took magazines from dead soldiers and distributed them to the living. Scott was everywhere that afternoon, moving through enemy fire with an apparent disregard for his own safety, showing a level of physical courage that inspired everyone who saw him. Other soldiers would later say that Scott's presence, his refusal to quit or show fear, kept them going when they wanted to give up. Scott survived the battle and would continue to serve in the Army, but he would carry the physical scars of his 2 wounds and the psychological scars of watching so many young soldiers die that terrible afternoon. Private First Class Arthur Vieira was an M60 machine gunner with Alpha Company. When the ambush began, Vieira immediately set up his machine gun and began firing at North Vietnamese positions. The M60 was a critical weapon in the defense, capable of putting out suppressing fire that could stop enemy attacks, or at least slow them down. Vieira fired burst after burst, sweeping his fire across the tree line, targeting muzzle flashes and movement in the grass. His assistant gunner fed ammunition belts into the weapon, and together they kept the machine gun firing. Then Vieira was hit, a round through his left leg that caused immediate intense pain. He collapsed behind the machine gun, but immediately pulled himself back up. He ignored the wound and kept firing. Minutes later, he was hit again, this time in the shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Other soldiers moved to pull him away from the gun, to treat his wounds, but Vieira fought them off. He crawled back to the machine gun and kept firing. He would fire that machine gun for over 3 hours, wounded twice, refusing to be evacuated until the fighting had died down and other soldiers could take over his position. Vieira would be awarded the Silver Star for his actions, though he would always say he was just doing his job, doing what machine gunners are trained to do, keep the gun firing. Captain Myron de Durick commanded Bravo Company, which had been at the tail of the column when the ambush was sprung. De Durick immediately recognized that if he tried to push his company forward through the North Vietnamese positions to link up with the rest of the battalion, his company would be destroyed piecemeal. Instead, he made the tactically sound but emotionally difficult decision to pull Bravo Company into a tight defensive perimeter and hold their ground. This decision saved his company, but it meant that Bravo Company couldn't immediately help the rest of the battalion, which was being destroyed ahead of them. Throughout the afternoon, Diederik had to listen to the sounds of battle from the direction of Albany, knowing that soldiers were dying, knowing that the battalion was taking heavy casualties, but also knowing that taking his company forward into that chaos would only add to the casualty count. He maintained discipline, kept his perimeter organized, repelled North Vietnamese attacks on his position, and waited for an opportunity to help. When darkness fell and the intensity of the fighting decreased, de Durick moved his company forward and linked up with the main perimeter, bringing fresh troops that helped secure the position and assisted with the evacuation of casualties. Diederik's leadership showed that sometimes courage means making the hard decision, even when that decision feels like abandoning your comrades. Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, the executive officer of Alpha Company, spent the afternoon of November 17th organizing the defense of the battalion headquarters element. Gwynn wasn't a company commander. He was a staff officer who had been co-located with the headquarters when the attack began. But when chaos erupted and soldiers scattered, Gwynn stepped up and took charge of whoever he could reach. He organized headquarters personnel, clerks and radio operators who weren't trained infantrymen, into a fighting force. He positioned them, directed their fire, kept them calm when they wanted to panic. Gwynn moved constantly through the position, checking soldiers, encouraging them, making sure they were firing at the enemy and not just hiding in the grass. He coordinated with the artillery forward observers to bring fire missions in on North Vietnamese positions. He helped organize the evacuation of wounded soldiers, directing medics and assisting in moving casualties to the center of the perimeter where they could be treated. Gwynn showed the kind of leadership that defines good officers, taking responsibility, making decisions under fire, taking care of soldiers. He would survive the battle and would later write a memoir, Baptism, a Vietnam Memoir, that chronicles his experiences at Albany and provides one of the most detailed accounts of the battle from a participant's perspective. Specialist 4th Class Jack Smith was a headquarters company soldier who found himself in the middle of the kill zone when the ambush erupted. Smith had never fired his weapon in combat before November 17th. That afternoon, he would fire hundreds of rounds, killing North Vietnamese soldiers at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. When his rifle jammed, he picked up another weapon from a dead soldier and kept fighting. When he ran out of ammunition, he took magazines from casualties around him. When a North Vietnamese soldier charged his position, Smith killed him with a burst from his M16, then watched in horror as the man fell dead just a few feet away. Smith was wounded by shrapnel from a grenade, but kept fighting. He saw friends die around him, saw soldiers cut down by enemy fire, saw the grass literally running with blood. But he didn't give up. He kept fighting because that's what soldiers do. They fight for the men next to them, for their buddies, for survival. Smith would survive the battle and would later become a television producer and correspondent for ABC News. In 1967, he would write a searing account of the Battle of Albany for the Saturday Evening Post, an article titled Death in the Ia Drang Valley that remains one of the most powerful first-person accounts of combat ever written. Sergeant Clyde Savage was a squad leader with Alpha Company who spent the afternoon of November 17th keeping his men alive and fighting. When the ambush began, Savage immediately took charge, getting his squad into cover, organizing their fire, keeping them focused on fighting back rather than panicking. When men were wounded, Savage treated them or called for medics. When ammunition ran low, Savage redistributed what they had. When soldiers froze with fear, Savage talked them through it, kept them in the fight. Savage's squad took casualties throughout the afternoon, men killed or wounded by enemy fire. Each loss affected Savage deeply. These were his men, soldiers he was responsible for, friends he'd trained with and lived with for months. But Savage couldn't let grief or fear paralyze him. He had to keep the surviving members of his squad fighting, had to keep them alive. By the end of the battle, Savage's squad had been reduced to just a handful of men. But those men were alive because Savage had led them well, had made good tactical decisions, had shown courage when courage was needed. These stories of individual heroism, and hundreds of others like them, defined the American response at LZ Albany. The battalion had been ambushed, scattered, caught completely by surprise. But individual soldiers and small units fought back with incredible courage, holding positions against overwhelming odds, treating wounded comrades under fire, refusing to surrender or give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. They showed that American soldiers, even when surprised and outnumbered, would stand and fight. The outcome at Albany was a tactical disaster, but it was not a failure of courage or determination by the soldiers who fought there. In the days following the Battle of LZ Albany, the grim task of accounting for the casualties continued. The initial counts of 155 killed and 121 wounded were preliminary figures compiled in the chaos of the battle and its immediate aftermath. As search parties combed the battlefield and as wounded soldiers were evacuated to field hospitals, the true scope of the disaster became clearer. 155 American soldiers had been killed in action on November 17, 1965. These deaths represented the single bloodiest day of combat for American forces during the entire Vietnam War. No other day, in over 10 years of American involvement in Vietnam, would see as many American deaths in a single engagement. The names of these 155 soldiers would be added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., joining the over 58,000 other Americans who died in Southeast Asia. The casualties were not evenly distributed among the units. Charlie Company, which had been in the center of the ambush, suffered catastrophic losses. Of approximately 120 men in the company, over 90 were killed or wounded, a casualty rate of over 75%. The company had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. It would have to be rebuilt from scratch, with new soldiers, new officers, new NCOs. The survivors of Charlie Company would carry the trauma of that day for the rest of their lives, wondering why they had survived when so many others hadn't. Alpha Company also took heavy casualties, particularly the reconnaissance platoon that had walked into the North Vietnamese headquarters element at the beginning of the battle. That platoon was virtually wiped out in the first minutes of fighting, with the platoon leader and most of the soldiers killed before they could even establish a defensive position. The rest of Alpha Company fought throughout the afternoon and maintained better cohesion than most units, but they still suffered significant losses. Delta Company and the Battalion headquarters element also took heavy casualties. The headquarters security element, made up largely of clerks and administrative personnel who weren't trained infantrymen, fought bravely, but suffered heavily in the close quarters combat. Many headquarters soldiers, who had expected to spend their tours processing paperwork and maintaining communications, instead, found themselves in desperate firefights, and many of them didn't survive. Bravo Company, which had been at the tail of the column and had fought a separate battle, took the lightest casualties of any rifle company in the battalion. Captain Diederich's decision to form a tight defensive perimeter rather than trying to push forward through enemy positions had saved his company from being destroyed. Bravo Company still lost men, still fought hard throughout the afternoon, but their casualties were a fraction of what the other companies suffered. The 121 wounded soldiers varied widely in the severity of their injuries. Some had relatively minor wounds, shrapnel wounds or grazing gunshot wounds that were painful but not life-threatening. These men would be treated at field hospitals, spend some time recovering, and then return to duty. Others had serious wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Lost limbs, spinal injuries, traumatic brain injuries, severe burns, disfiguring facial wounds. These men would be evacuated to hospitals in Japan and then to the United States for long-term care and rehabilitation. Some of the wounded would die from their injuries in the hours or days following the battle. Men who had survived the initial trauma, who had been treated by medics on the battlefield and evacuated to field hospitals, would succumb to shock, to blood loss, to infections, to complications from their injuries. Each death added to the casualty count, another family to notify, another name to add to the growing list of Americans who had died at Albany. The psychological casualties from LZ Albany were harder to quantify, but no less real. Every survivor of the battle carried mental scars, memories of horror that would haunt them for decades. Many would develop what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering from nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, depression, anxiety. Some would struggle with alcohol or drug abuse as they tried to cope with their experiences. Some would have difficulty maintaining relationships, holding jobs, functioning in civilian society. The battle had marked them, changed them, in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Survivor's guilt was particularly acute among those who had lived through Albany. Why had they survived when so many others had died? What made them special? Why had the North Vietnamese soldier who shot at them missed while the one who shot at their friend hit him? The answers to these questions were random chance, luck, fate. But that randomness was psychologically difficult to process. Many survivors felt they should have done more, should have fought harder, should have somehow saved the men who died. This guilt, irrational but powerful, would be a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. The families of the 155 dead soldiers bore their own terrible burden. In homes across America, casualty notification officers knocked on doors and delivered the news that would shatter families. Parents who had sent their sons to war learned that those sons would never come home. Wives became widows, children lost fathers, siblings lost brothers. Each death rippled outward, affecting dozens or hundreds of people who had loved that soldier, The timing made it worse. November 1965 was early in the war, before most Americans fully understood what the Vietnam War would become. These families had believed the government's assurances that American forces would win quickly, that casualties would be light, that their sons and husbands would come home safely. The massacre at LZ Albany shattered those illusions. It showed that American soldiers could be defeated, could be caught by surprise, could die in large numbers in a single afternoon. This realization, multiplied across the 155 families, contributed to the growing skepticism about the war that would eventually turn most Americans against continued involvement in Vietnam. North Vietnamese casualties at LZ Albany were also significant, though exact numbers remain disputed. American estimates immediately after the battle claimed over 400 North Vietnamese soldiers killed. These numbers were based on body counts, on estimates from aerial observation, and on intelligence reports. But body count numbers in Vietnam were notoriously unreliable, often inflated to make engagements look more successful than they actually were. Lieutenant Colonel McDade himself would later state that he never reported seeing 400 North Vietnamese bodies, and that the actual number he observed was closer to 200. North Vietnamese sources acknowledged approximately 200 casualties, killed and wounded combined, at LZ Albany. This number is probably more accurate than the American estimate, though it's also possible that North Vietnamese casualty reports were understated for political reasons. The truth is probably somewhere between the two extremes. The North Vietnamese likely suffered 200 to 300 casualties at Albany. Significant losses, but far lower than what the Americans suffered. What's indisputable is that both sides paid a terrible price in blood at LZ Albany. The Americans suffered the highest single-day casualties of the entire war. The North Vietnamese lost hundreds of soldiers, men who had trained for years, who had marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail for months, who were supposed to be part of the offensive that would cut South Vietnam in half. The battle had been extraordinarily costly for both sides, and the strategic outcome was ambiguous at best. In the weeks and months following the Battle of LZ Albany, multiple investigations were launched to determine what had happened and why. The disaster was too significant to ignore. An American battalion had walked into an ambush and been virtually destroyed. Over half the soldiers in that battalion had become casualties in a single afternoon. This wasn't just a tactical setback, it was a catastrophe that demanded answers and accountability. The official Army investigation focused on several key questions. Why had the battalion been moving in an administrative column rather than a combat formation? Why hadn't adequate reconnaissance been conducted along the route to Albany? Why had Lieutenant Colonel McDade called his company commanders forward for a meeting, leaving their companies leaderless at a critical moment? Why hadn't the battalion detected the large North Vietnamese force that was clearly in the area before walking into it? The answers to these questions revealed a series of tactical errors and misjudgments that had combined to create the conditions for disaster. McDade had been told that the area between X-Ray and Albany was clear of enemy forces, that the North Vietnamese had withdrawn from the Ia Drang Valley after their defeat at X-Ray. Based on this intelligence, which proved to be completely wrong, McDade had conducted what he believed was an administrative movement to an extraction point, rather than a combat patrol through contested territory. But even accepting that the intelligence was faulty, McDade had made tactical errors that contributed to the disaster. The battalion had been strung out in a long, vulnerable column stretching over 550 yards. This formation made it impossible for companies to support each other if attacked. When the ambush was sprung, units were too far apart to mass fires or to come to each other's aid. The battalion was defeated in detail, with companies and platoons fighting isolated battles rather than a coordinated defense. McDade's decision to call his company commanders forward for a meeting was highlighted in the investigation as a critical error. This decision left the companies leaderless at exactly the moment when they most needed their commanders. When the ambush began, executive officers and platoon sergeants tried to take command, but they lacked the authority and the situational awareness of the company commanders. The breakdown of leadership at the company level contributed significantly to the chaos and the high casualties. The lack of adequate reconnaissance was another failure identified in the investigation. The battalion had no clear picture of what was ahead of them or to their flanks. The point elements were not moving with the caution appropriate for contested terrain. There were no patrols sent out to screen the column or to check potential ambush sites. When the battalion halted in the column, no security elements were sent out to establish a perimeter. All of these were violations of basic infantry tactics, and all of them contributed to the battalion's vulnerability. The investigation also looked at the performance of higher headquarters. Why had brigade and division headquarters accepted faulty intelligence about enemy forces in the area? Why hadn't they insisted on more thorough reconnaissance before sending a battalion through terrain that was obviously dangerous? Why hadn't they coordinated artillery and air support to be immediately available when McDade's battalion started its movement? These were failures at the operational level that had left the battalion unsupported and vulnerable. But the investigation was careful not to place all the blame on McDade or on higher headquarters. The report acknowledged that the North Vietnamese had executed a near-perfect ambush, that they had achieved complete tactical surprise, and that they had exploited every American mistake with skill and aggression. The report noted that the fighting spirit and courage of individual American soldiers had prevented an even greater disaster, that the scattered elements of the battalion had fought back effectively despite being surprised and outnumbered. The investigation resulted in several lessons learned documents that were distributed throughout the Army. These documents emphasized the importance of maintaining proper tactical formations even during administrative movements, the need for adequate reconnaissance in all terrain, the criticality of maintaining unit cohesion and leadership continuity, and the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities. Future battalion commanders were specifically instructed to study the Battle of Albany as an example of what not to do, of how tactical errors can lead to catastrophe even with brave and well-trained soldiers. But no amount of lessons learned or after-action reports could change what had happened at Albany, or bring back the 155 dead soldiers. The investigation provided answers to questions about tactics and leadership, but it couldn't provide meaning to the deaths or comfort to the families who had lost loved ones. For many people, the investigation felt like an attempt to assign blame rather than a genuine effort to understand what had happened and prevent it from happening again. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade bore the weight of Albany for the rest of his life. He had been in command of the battalion. He had made the tactical decisions that led his men into the ambush, and 155 soldiers had died as a result. McDade wasn't relieved of command. He wasn't court-martialed or formally reprimanded. But the stain of Albany followed him throughout his military career and into his retirement. He would replay that day over and over in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently, wishing he could go back and make different decisions, knowing that he couldn't. McDade would continue to serve in the Army, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. But Albany defined his legacy in a way that his other accomplishments never could. When people talked about Robert McDade, they talked about Albany. When historians wrote about the Battle of Ia Drang, they focused on Hal Moore's success at X-Ray and McDade's disaster at Albany. McDade would attend reunions of 7th Cavalry veterans, and he would see in the eyes of the survivors the unspoken question, why? Why did you march us into that ambush? Why did you call the commanders forward? Why did so many men have to die? The Battle of Albany, despite the heavy American casualties, was officially classified as a victory. The North Vietnamese had been forced to withdraw from the battlefield. American forces had held their ground and had inflicted what were claimed to be heavy casualties on the enemy. The Ia Drang campaign as a whole, including both X-Ray and Albany, was presented to the American public as proof that American forces could defeat North Vietnamese regulars in conventional combat. But the reality was more complex and more troubling. Yes, the North Vietnamese had withdrawn from the battlefield at Albany, but they had accomplished their mission. They had demonstrated that they could fight effectively against American forces, that they could inflict heavy casualties, that they had tactics that could neutralize American advantages in firepower and technology. The hugging tactics, getting so close to American positions that artillery and air support couldn't be used, had worked exactly as intended. The North Vietnamese had learned from X-Ray, had adapted their tactics, and had shown that they could win engagements against American battalions. From the North Vietnamese perspective, Albany was a significant victory. They had ambushed and nearly destroyed an American battalion. They had killed 155 American soldiers, the highest single-day American casualties of the entire war. They had demonstrated that American forces were vulnerable, that they made mistakes, that they could be defeated. This victory boosted morale among North Vietnamese forces and reinforced their confidence that they could outlast the Americans, that they could make the war so costly in American lives that eventually the American people would demand withdrawal. The strategic implications of Albany were profound and would shape the course of the war. On the American side, the battle reinforced the belief in attrition warfare. If American forces could inflict casualty exchange ratios of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or even higher, the thinking went, then eventually the North Vietnamese would run out of soldiers and would be forced to negotiate. This belief in the power of firepower and the strategy of attrition would drive American tactics for years, leading to more search and destroy operations, more emphasis on body counts, more attempts to find and fix enemy forces so they could be destroyed by American firepower. But this strategy had a fundamental flaw, one that Albany helped to expose. The North Vietnamese were willing to accept casualties that Americans were not. The North Vietnamese leadership was willing to lose thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of soldiers, if that's what it took to achieve reunification and independence. The American people, watching casualty reports on the evening news, were not willing to accept those kinds of losses indefinitely, especially in a war that lacked clear objectives and seemed to have no end in sight. Albany also influenced tactical development throughout the Army. The lessons learned from the battle were incorporated into training, doctrine, and operational planning. Battalions were drilled on maintaining proper formations, on conducting reconnaissance, on keeping units together where they could support each other. The importance of leadership continuity was emphasized, with commanders being told never to leave their units leaderless, even for brief meetings or conferences. Infantry tactics were refined to reduce vulnerability to ambush and to improve the ability to fight effectively when surprised. The battle had a profound impact on helicopter tactics and employment. At X-Ray, helicopters had been decisive, bringing in reinforcements, evacuating casualties, providing fire support. At Albany, the long column march had been chosen, partly to avoid using helicopters for the extraction from X-Ray, where they would have been vulnerable to North Vietnamese observation from the mountain. But the decision to march rather than fly had led directly to the ambush. Future operations would try to balance the vulnerability of helicopters with the vulnerability of ground movement, but the preference would increasingly be for helicopter mobility whenever possible. For the 1st Cavalry Division specifically, Albany was a sobering reminder that the new airmobile concept, while revolutionary, did not guarantee success. Helicopters provided mobility and firepower, but they couldn't prevent tactical errors or guarantee good intelligence. The division would continue to refine its tactics, to develop better procedures for reconnaissance and security, to improve coordination between air and ground elements. But Albany showed that technology alone wasn't enough. Sound tactics, good leadership, and careful planning were still essential. The political impact of Albany was muted because the battle was overshadowed by the more successful engagement at LZ X-Ray, and because the overall Ia Drang campaign was presented as a victory. Most Americans never learned the full story of what happened at Albany. The newspaper headlines focused on the total casualty figures for the campaign and on the claims of North Vietnamese casualties killed. The story became about American success, about proving that American forces could win in Vietnam, not about the disaster of November 17th. But for those who knew the true story, Albany was troubling. Military analysts and thoughtful officers recognized that the battle revealed serious weaknesses in American tactics and intelligence. If an American battalion could be surprised and nearly destroyed by an enemy that was supposedly in retreat, what did that say about the Army's ability to fight this war effectively? If North Vietnamese forces could adapt their tactics so quickly and so effectively, what did that mean for the long-term prospects of the American effort? These questions wouldn't be answered for years, but Albany planted the seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into broader skepticism about the war. The battle showed that Vietnam would not be easy, that American casualties would be high, that victory would be elusive. For soldiers fighting in Vietnam, Albany became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the enemy was skilled and dangerous, that mistakes could be fatal, that survival required constant vigilance and sound tactics. The soldiers who survived the Battle of LZ Albany carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. For most, it was the defining experience of their time in Vietnam and often of their entire lives. The battle had marked them, changed them in fundamental ways. They had looked death in the face for 4 hours. They had seen friends killed, had killed enemy soldiers themselves, had experienced violence and chaos that civilians could never understand. And they had survived, which brought its own complicated emotions. Survivor's guilt was nearly universal among Albany veterans. Why had they lived when so many others had died? What made them special? Was it skill? Was it luck? Was it divine intervention? The rational answer was that it was random chance, that the bullets and grenades that killed other men had simply missed them. But this rational answer didn't help with the emotional burden of surviving when friends and comrades didn't. Lieutenant Larry Gwynn returned to the United States after his tour in Vietnam and left the Army. He went to law school, became a lawyer, tried to build a normal life. But Albany haunted him. He had nightmares about the battle, flashbacks triggered by loud noises or sudden movements. He struggled with depression and anger. It took him decades to process what he'd experienced, to come to terms with his survival and with the death of so many soldiers he'd known and served with. Eventually, Gwynn wrote his memoir, Baptism, a Vietnam Memoir, partly as therapy, partly to honor the men who had died, partly to tell a story that he felt needed to be told. Jack Smith, the headquarters company soldier who had found himself in the middle of the killing zone, also struggled with his memories of Albany. Smith became a successful television journalist with ABC News, but the battle was always with him. In 1967, just 2 years after Albany, Smith wrote his account of the battle for the Saturday Evening Post. The article, Death in the Ia Drang Valley, was powerful and searing, describing the horror of the battle and the casual brutality of the North Vietnamese soldiers who had executed wounded Americans. The article brought the reality of the war home to many Americans who had thought of Vietnam as a distant, abstract conflict. Bob Towles, who had been wounded 3 times and had lain in the grass for hours as the battle raged around him, survived his wounds and eventually returned to the United States. But he was never the same. The physical wounds healed, more or less, but the psychological wounds remained. Towles struggled with PTSD for decades, with nightmares and anxiety and depression. He had difficulty maintaining relationships and holding jobs. The battle had broken something in him, something that could never be fully repaired. Captain Myron Dedurick continued his military career after Albany. He was recognized for his leadership of Bravo Company during the battle, for his tactical skill in pulling his company into a defensive perimeter and holding it against enemy attacks. Dedurick would eventually retire as a colonel, having served with distinction for over 20 years. But even Dedurick carried the weight of Albany. He had made the right decision tactically, but that didn't make it easier to live with the knowledge that the rest of the battalion had been destroyed while his company held back. He wondered if there was something more he could have done, some way he could have helped without getting his own men killed. Many Albany survivors dealt with their trauma through alcohol or drugs. In the years after Vietnam, substance abuse was common among combat veterans trying to cope with PTSD and survivors' guilt. Some veterans descended into addiction, losing jobs and families, ending up homeless or in prison. Others managed to maintain functioning lives while using alcohol or drugs to self-medicate, to numb the memories, to get through the days and nights. The Veterans Administration was ill-equipped to deal with the psychological casualties of Vietnam in the 1970s and 80s, and many veterans struggled for years without effective help. The survivors who did best were often those who found ways to give meaning to their survival. Some became advocates for veterans, working to improve services and benefits for those who had served. Some became active in veterans organizations, finding community and understanding among other combat veterans. Some returned to school, started businesses, raised families, built successful lives that honored the memory of those who hadn't made it home. These survivors carried Albany with them always, but they found ways to live with it, to integrate it into their lives rather than being paralyzed by it. Reunions of 7th Cavalry veterans became important events for many Albany survivors. These gatherings, often held on or near November 17th, provided opportunities for veterans to see each other, to share memories, to honor the dead, and to find some measure of peace. At these reunions, men who had fought together at Albany could talk about their experiences with people who understood, who had been there, who knew what it was like. The reunions were often emotional, with tears and embraces and long conversations that lasted into the night. At these reunions, the survivors would visit memorials to those who died. They would read names, remember faces, tell stories about friends who hadn't made it home. They would talk about the battle, about specific moments and specific people, keeping the memory alive. And they would renew their commitment to each other and to the memory of the fallen, promising never to forget, promising to tell the story so that others would know what happened at Albany. Some survivors made pilgrimages back to Vietnam in later years. After relations between the United States and Vietnam normalized, they traveled to the Ia Drang Valley, to the site of LZ Albany, to stand on the ground where they had fought and where their friends had died. For some, this return brought closure, a chance to confront the demons that had haunted them for decades. For others, it was overwhelming, bringing back memories and emotions they thought they had dealt with. But all agreed it was important, a way of honoring the past and trying to find peace. The families of the 155 dead soldiers had their own journey of grief and healing. Some families were destroyed by the loss, parents who never recovered from losing a son, wives who struggled to raise children alone, siblings who felt survivors' guilt even though they hadn't been in Vietnam. Other families found ways to honor their lost loved one's memory, establishing scholarships, supporting veterans' causes, keeping the memory alive through stories and photographs. Many families felt betrayed by the government that had sent their sons to Vietnam. They felt that the death had been meaningless, that their loved one had died for nothing in a war that America would eventually lose. This feeling of betrayal was compounded by the way Vietnam veterans were treated when they came home, often ignored or scorned rather than honored. The families of the Albany dead felt that their sacrifice had been forgotten, that their loss meant nothing to a country that just wanted to forget about Vietnam. But time brought some measure of healing, if not complete peace. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1982, provided a place for families to go, to see their loved one's name, to leave flowers or mementos, to feel that the sacrifice was recognized and remembered. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for many Albany families, a sacred space where they could connect with the memory of the soldier they had lost. The Battle of LZ Albany stands as one of the most significant engagements of the Vietnam War, not because it changed the strategic situation or because it represented a turning point in the conflict, but because it revealed so much about the nature of the war and the challenges that American forces faced. The lessons of Albany were studied by military officers for decades afterward, incorporated into training and doctrine, used as a case study in what not to do. The most obvious tactical lesson was the importance of maintaining proper formations and security, even during what appears to be an administrative movement. McDade's battalion had moved in a long, vulnerable column because they believed the area was safe and the march was just a movement to an extraction point. This belief, based on faulty intelligence, led directly to disaster when the battalion walked into an ambush. Future commanders were taught never to assume an area is safe, always to maintain tactical formations, always to conduct adequate reconnaissance, always to be prepared for contact with the enemy. The lesson about leadership continuity was equally important. McDade's decision to call his company commanders forward for a meeting had left companies leaderless at the critical moment when the ambush was sprung. This breakdown in leadership contributed significantly to the chaos and the high casualties. Future doctrine emphasized that commanders should not leave their units, that meetings should be conducted by radio when possible, and that if leaders must be pulled away from their units, the timing must be carefully considered and adequate security must be in place. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance was another critical lesson. The battalion had moved based on intelligence that said the area was clear of enemy forces. This intelligence was completely wrong, and the battalion paid the price for trusting it without verification. Albany taught that intelligence must be verified through reconnaissance, that commanders must personally assess the terrain and the situation rather than relying entirely on reports from higher headquarters, and that aggressive patrolling is essential to maintain situational awareness. The battle also taught lessons about the nature of the enemy and the type of war being fought in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had shown at Albany that they could adapt their tactics, that they understood American strengths and weaknesses, that they had effective methods to neutralize American firepower. The hugging tactics, getting close enough to American positions that artillery, and air support couldn't be used, would be employed throughout the war with varying degrees of success. American forces had to learn to fight at close range, to be prepared for hand-to-hand combat, to be able to win even when their technological advantages were neutralized. But Albany also taught broader lessons about the strategy and conduct of the war. The battle showed that body counts were a poor metric for success. Even if the American claims of North Vietnamese casualties were accurate, even if the casualty exchange ratio favored the Americans, the political and psychological impact of losing 155 soldiers in a single afternoon was devastating. The American public was not prepared to accept those kinds of casualties, especially in a war where the objectives were unclear and progress was hard to measure. The North Vietnamese, by contrast, seemed willing to accept whatever casualties were necessary to achieve their goals. The battle revealed the limitations of the search and destroy strategy. Finding and fixing enemy forces so they could be destroyed by American firepower sounded good in theory, but Albany showed how difficult and dangerous it was in practice. The enemy chose when and where to fight. They had the advantage of knowing the terrain. They could mass forces for attacks and then disperse before American reinforcements and firepower could be brought to bear. Search and destroy operations would continue throughout the war, but Albany demonstrated their limitations and their costs. Albany also highlighted the importance of small unit leadership and the courage of individual soldiers. Despite being ambushed and scattered, despite taking catastrophic casualties, despite chaos and confusion, the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had fought back. Small groups and individual soldiers had held positions, treated wounded, killed enemy troops, and refused to give up. This fighting spirit, this refusal to surrender even in desperate circumstances, was one of the great strengths of American forces in Vietnam. But it also meant that soldiers paid a terrible price for tactical errors made by their commanders. The legacy of LZ Albany extends beyond the specific tactical and operational lessons. The battle became a symbol of the Vietnam War itself. The courage of soldiers caught in impossible situations, the costs of faulty intelligence and poor planning, the determination of the enemy, the difficulty of achieving clear victories, the sense that young men were dying in a war that seemed to have no end or purpose. Albany encapsulated all of these themes in one terrible afternoon. For the 7th Cavalry Regiment, Albany became part of the unit's history and tradition, alongside the glory of Gary Owen and the tragedy of Little Bighorn. The regiment had faced disaster before, when Custer's battalion was annihilated by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors in 1876. Now, 89 years later, another 7th Cavalry Battalion had been nearly destroyed in a different kind of wilderness against a different enemy. The regiment honored both battles, remembering the courage of the soldiers who fought and died, vowing never to forget the lessons learned in blood. The battle influenced how the Army thought about leadership, tactics, and training for decades. Officers studying at the Army's schools and colleges analyzed Albany, dissected the decisions that led to disaster, debated what could have been done differently. The battle became a standard case study, taught alongside other famous engagements as an example of how tactical errors can lead to catastrophe, regardless of the courage and quality of the soldiers involved. Albany also contributed to the broader national conversation about the Vietnam War. As the details of the battle became known, as the casualty figures were published, as survivors told their stories, Americans began to understand that Vietnam was not going to be the quick, easy victory that had been promised. The battle, along with others like it, contributed to growing public skepticism about the war, to questions about whether the costs were worth whatever benefits might be achieved, to demands that American forces be brought home. Today, more than 5 decades after the Battle of LZ Albany, the story of that terrible afternoon continues to be remembered and told. The 155 Americans who died on November 17, 1965, are honored on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., their names carved into the black granite wall, along with the names of over 58,000 other Americans who died in Southeast Asia. Visitors to the memorial can find those names, can touch them, can leave flowers or mementos, can honor the sacrifice of soldiers who died in a distant jungle for a cause that many Americans never fully understood. Panel 22, East of the Vietnam Veterans. Memorial contains many of the names of those who died at Albany. The names are arranged chronologically by date of death, and November 17, 1965, takes up a significant portion of the panel. Standing before that section of the wall, looking at name after name after name, all with the same date of death, brings home the scope of the disaster in a way that statistics alone cannot. These weren't just numbers, they were individuals, young men with names and faces and families, soldiers who went to war and never came home. Lieutenant Donald Cornett was one of those names on the wall. Cornett was 24 years old, a platoon leader with Charlie Company, a friend of Lieutenant Larry Gwynn. Cornett was killed in the early stages of the ambush, dying less than 100 yards from where Gwynn lay wounded. Gwynn would survive and would spend decades telling people about his friend, about the battle where Cornett died, about the lessons that should be learned from Albany. Cornett's name represents all the others, all the young lieutenants and sergeants and privates who died that afternoon. The survivors of Albany, those who are still alive, are now in their 70s and 80s. Each year there are fewer of them. Time, the great equalizer, is claiming what North Vietnamese bullets missed, but the survivors continue to gather for reunions, continue to remember, continue to honor the dead. They tell their stories to whoever will listen, to family members, to historians, to students, to anyone interested in understanding what happened at Albany and why it matters. James Lawrence, a platoon leader at Albany who was severely wounded but survived, has made it his mission to keep the memory of the battle alive. Lawrence has written about his experiences, has spoken at military events and schools, has shared his memories with anyone who wants to hear them. For Lawrence, telling the story of Albany is not just about remembering the past. It's about teaching lessons that might save lives in future conflicts, about honoring the men who died, about ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. The site of LZ Albany today is jungle again, reclaimed by the vegetation that grows so quickly in the central highlands of Vietnam. There are no monuments at the site, no markers indicating that a battle was fought there, or that 155 Americans died there. The Ia Drang Valley is remote and difficult to access, and few people visit the battlefield. But for those who do make the journey, who stand on the ground where the battle was fought, there is a sense of the sacred, a feeling that this place is hallowed by the blood that was shed there. Some veterans have returned to the site in recent years, as relations between the United States and Vietnam have normalized, and as travel to Vietnam has become easier. These return visits are often emotional, bringing back memories that have been suppressed for decades, forcing veterans to confront the trauma of what they experienced. But many veterans say that returning to the battlefield brought them some measure of peace, that standing on that ground as an old man rather than a terrified young soldier helped them to process their experiences and to honor their fallen comrades. The story of LZ Albany has been told in books, in documentaries, in academic studies. The most famous account is in the book We Were Soldiers Once, and Young by Hal Moore and Joseph Galloway, which covers both LZ X-Ray and LZ Albany. Larry Gwynn's memoir, Baptism, provides a detailed first-person account of the battle from a participant's perspective. Jack Smith's article, Death in the Ia Drang Valley, remains one of the most powerful pieces of combat journalism ever written. These accounts ensure that the story of Albany continues to be told, that new generations can learn about what happened and why it matters. The battle has also been studied by military historians and tacticians, analyzed in professional journals and academic papers, used as a teaching tool at military schools. The tactical errors that led to the disaster have been dissected. The decisions that contributed to the high casualties have been debated. The lessons that should be learned have been cataloged. Albany has become a standard case study in how not to conduct military operations, how mistakes at the command level can lead to catastrophe at the tactical level, how the courage of soldiers cannot always overcome poor planning and execution. But beyond the tactical and operational lessons, Albany is remembered because of the human cost. 155 young Americans, most of them just out of their teens or in their early 20s, died in a single afternoon. They died far from home, in a jungle in Southeast Asia, fighting an enemy they often couldn't see, in a war that many of them didn't fully understand. They died because they were soldiers, because they had been ordered to march to Albany, because they trusted their leaders to get them through safely. Their deaths represent the cost of war in its most tangible form. Young lives ended, families shattered, futures erased. The families of those who died at Albany carry their own memories and their own burden of loss. For them, Albany isn't ancient history or a case study in tactics. It's the day their son or brother or husband died, the day their world changed forever, the wound that never fully healed. These families deserve to have the story told accurately and respectfully, to have the sacrifice of their loved ones recognized and honored, to know that the soldiers who died at Albany are remembered with gratitude and respect. The Battle of Landing Zone. Albany stands as the bloodiest single day of combat in the Vietnam War. In 4 hours on the afternoon of November 17, 1965, 155 American soldiers died, and 121 more were wounded when the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, was ambushed by North Vietnamese forces in the Ia Drang Valley. It was a disaster that revealed the challenges and dangers of fighting the Vietnam War, a tragedy that showed how quickly things could go wrong, even with brave and well-trained soldiers. The battle happened because of a series of errors and misjudgments. Faulty intelligence led commanders to believe the area was clear of enemy forces, when in fact hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers were present. The decision to conduct an administrative march rather than a combat patrol left the battalion vulnerable to ambush. The long, strung-out column formation made it impossible for units to support each other when attacked. The decision to call company commanders forward for a meeting left companies leaderless at the critical moment. All of these factors combined to create the conditions for catastrophe. But the battle also showcased the incredible courage and determination of American soldiers. Despite being ambushed and scattered, despite taking catastrophic casualties, despite chaos and confusion, the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry fought back. They held positions against overwhelming odds. They treated wounded comrades under fire. They refused to surrender or give up. Their courage could not prevent the disaster, but it prevented an even greater catastrophe. They showed that American soldiers, even when surprised and outnumbered, would stand and fight. The North Vietnamese also showed courage and tactical skill at Albany. They executed a near-perfect ambush, achieving complete surprise, closing quickly with American positions to neutralize American firepower, fighting with determination despite taking significant casualties themselves. They demonstrated that they could fight effectively against American forces, that they had learned from previous engagements, that they had developed tactics that could succeed against technologically superior forces. Albany was a victory for the North Vietnamese, one that boosted their confidence and showed that they could outlast the Americans. The aftermath of Albany was difficult for everyone involved. The families of the 155 dead soldiers bore a burden of grief that would never fully lift. The wounded soldiers, many with injuries that would affect them for life, faced long recoveries and uncertain futures. The survivors carried psychological scars, memories of horror, survivors' guilt that would haunt them for decades. And the officers and commanders who had made the decisions that led to the disaster carried the weight of responsibility for those deaths. The Army investigated what went wrong at Albany and incorporated the lessons learned into training and doctrine. Future commanders were taught to maintain proper formations, to conduct adequate reconnaissance, to keep units together where they could support each other, to never assume an area is safe. The battle became a case study in tactical errors and their consequences, taught at military schools and studied by officers throughout the Army. The lessons of Albany, written in blood, would help prevent similar disasters in future operations. But no amount of lessons learned or tactical improvements could change what happened on November the 17th, 1965. The 155 soldiers who died at Albany remained dead. Their families remained bereaved. The survivors remained traumatized. The battle remained a tragedy, a terrible day in the Vietnam War that showed the human cost of combat and the price of tactical errors. The legacy of LZ Albany is complex and multi-layered. It's a story of tragedy and heroism, of mistakes and courage, of death and survival. It's a reminder of the dangers of faulty intelligence and poor planning, of the importance of sound tactics and good leadership. It's a testament to the courage of soldiers who fight even when fighting seems hopeless, who stand when standing seems impossible, who refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier. For the Vietnam War as a whole, Albany was a harbinger of things to come. The battle showed that the war would be long and costly, that American casualties would be high, that victory would be elusive. It showed that the enemy was skilled and determined, willing to accept casualties, able to adapt tactics to counter American advantages. Albany, along with battles like it, contributed to the growing American skepticism about the war, to the sense that the costs outweighed the benefits, to the eventual decision to withdraw American forces from Vietnam. For the men who fought at Albany, the battle was the defining experience of their lives. They carry the memories of that afternoon with them always, the chaos and fear, the friends who died, the moments of courage and desperation, the miracle of survival. They remember the names and faces of those who didn't make it home. They honor the sacrifice of their comrades. And they continue to tell the story, ensuring that future generations know about LZ Albany and the soldiers who fought there. The 155 Americans who died at LZ Albany deserve to be remembered. They were soldiers who did their duty, who went where they were ordered to go, who fought when called upon to fight. They didn't make the political decisions that sent them to Vietnam. They didn't choose the tactics or the strategy. They just tried to do their jobs and survive. And they paid the ultimate price. Their names are carved into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Their memories are carried by families and friends and fellow soldiers. Their story is told in books and articles and documentaries. And their sacrifice is honored by those who understand what they gave, what they endured, what they mean to the history of the Vietnam War, and to the history of the American military. The Battle of LZ Albany was the bloodiest single day of the Vietnam War. It was a day when courage could not overcome catastrophic tactical errors, when brave soldiers paid the price for their commander's mistakes, when an American battalion was nearly destroyed in a jungle in Southeast Asia. It was a day that showed the true face of war: chaotic, violent, random, cruel, unforgiving. We remember LZ Albany not to glorify war or to celebrate violence. We remember it to honor those who fought there, to recognize their sacrifice, to learn from the mistakes that led to tragedy, to ensure that their deaths were not meaningless. We remember it because forgetting such events, consigning them to historical oblivion, dishonors everyone who served and everyone who died in Vietnam. The sun set over the Ia Drang Valley on November 17, 1965, on a battlefield, soaked in blood. 155 American soldiers lay dead in the elephant grass and jungle. 121 more were wounded. A battalion had been shattered. Families would be shattered. Lives would be changed forever. And the Vietnam War would continue for another 10 years, claiming thousands more American lives and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese lives before finally ending in American withdrawal and North Vietnamese victory. But on that November afternoon, in that remote valley, at that small clearing called Landing Zone Albany, American soldiers had fought and died with courage and honor. They had faced an enemy that outnumbered them, that had surprised them, that was determined to destroy them. And they had fought back, refusing to surrender, refusing to give up, showing the kind of courage that defines the American soldier in every war. May we never forget the Battle of LZ Albany. May we honor the 155 who died there. May we remember the survivors who carry the scars of that day. May we learn from the mistakes that led to tragedy. And may we ensure that the story of LZ Albany continues to be told to future generations, so that the sacrifice of those who fought there is never forgotten. This is the story of LZ Albany. Remember it, honor it, learn from it, and never forget the soldiers who fought and died on that bloodiest day of America's longest war.